Hi, I'm Liz Hamson, editor of Property Week. Thanks for joining me for what promises to be a fascinating conversation with Dentons real estate partner Deepa Deb on reimagining the high street. And never has there been a greater need to do just that. Already on its knees, the high street has been dealt what for many already ailing household names has been a killer blow by the COVID-19 pandemic. Online retail, on the other hand, has enjoyed a purple patch. The only factor constraining its exponential growth has been the capacity of warehousing and logistics to meet the spike in demand. So what does it all mean for the high street? What does the future hold? Well, let's start with the growing polarisation between the fortunes of online and physical retail. People are talking about COVID-19 accelerating trends such as the rise of e-commerce and the demise of bricks and mortar retail. Deepa, how do you think the recent rise of online shopping will reshape the retail sector in the long term?
Thank you, Liz. We've already seen the almost immediate impact of COVID-19 on some well-known brands. We've lost Debenhams, Cath Kidston, Oasis, Warehouse, Office, TM Lewin, to name but a few. And really sadly, I think we all recognise that the list won't stop there. The isolation economy that's been produced by the reaction to the lockdown has changed our shopping habits. We're all now buying groceries, alcohol, focusing on our hobbies, whether that's exercise, arts and crafts, or learning a new language, and buying entertainment. And crucially, we're doing all of that online. The real question is this a long-term change in our shopping habits and behaviour, or is it a temporary shift until such time as we can go back to normal, whatever normal means?
And what's your feeling about that? Do you think some of the changes that we've seen are permanent, or are we going to just forget all about this in a year's time once the vaccine has been discovered?
Well, like most global businesses, at Dentons, we've been collaborating really closely with all of our colleagues across the globe to try and see whether we can glean from their experiences whether there has been a seismic change in behaviour. And really interestingly, our colleagues in China, Hong Kong and South Korea have actually reported that there has been an uptick in market sentiment and in retail activity since the easing of the lockdown where they are and the opening of some non-essential businesses. However, they've all confirmed that activity hasn't gone back to pre-pandemic levels, and that's even in jurisdictions that are way ahead of us on the curve of controlling the pandemic. So although some commentators will try and persuade us that post the easing of the lockdown in the UK, we're all going to rush out to the shops to go and experience bricks and mortar retail, the evidence globally suggests otherwise.
So, and is the retailing that we're seeing reopen elsewhere, is it socially distanced retailing, or have people just opened back up as they were before but lower footfall?
Interestingly, it depends where you're at in the world. So in Southeast Asia, they are still maintaining social distancing, but not the 2 meters that we are. And they're much closer, and they're actually relying more heavily on contact tracing. Similarly, in parts of Europe, again, they are socially distancing, but the distances are far closer than ours. So they haven't had the same impact on footfall that we're seeing here in the UK, even in the essential retail sector. But one thing that we're all agreed on is that the fact that vast swathes of us are working productively from home, most of us are communicating very effectively via technology the way you and I are today, means that we've necessarily reevaluated what we need. And most of what we need, we can now source online or locally. So the prevailing view seems to be that this will inevitably lead to a permanent shift in the retail landscape, and it's going to compel retailers to have to rethink their retail strategies and their business models.
And do you get the sense that they are actually doing that? And I mean, obviously they were having to rethink already because, as we mentioned earlier, the retail sector has been on its knees for some time. We've seen a wave of CVAs and businesses going into administration, very uncertain futures. That didn't seem to be enough to force them to rethink and reimagine. Do you think COVID-19 will force them to do that? And how do you think they're going to reinvent themselves to be fit for the future? What's a successful retailer going to look like?
It's really interesting. You're absolutely right, Liz. Of course, we'd seen the impact on retail pre-COVID, but what COVID has done now is almost accelerate the changes that need to happen. And we've seen the difference between those retailers that look like they're weathering the storm and those that are disappearing. And it seems to be the case that retailers that have spotted changes in consumer spending habits and consumer wants and responded to those are the ones that seem to be surviving, whereas others haven't. So it's really interesting if you think about Marks and Spencer's tie-up with Ocado. It means that from September, when you and I order our bread and milk, we'll also be able to replenish our soft furnishings and order some much needed underwear for the kids, for example. Equally, John Lewis have gone on the record and said that they are very happy to partner with other businesses. In fact, they're very keen to do so in order to reduce their exposure to traditional retail and enhance the customer experience. And I think you recently reported on the fact that Next has launched the beauty hall concept.
Which parts of the retail market do you think are going to be particularly resilient, and which do you think remain vulnerable throughout this process?
Well, I think COVID-19 has shone a real light on those essential retailers that we're now so heavily dependent on, the food retailers, the pharmacists, the corner shops. We've all now got this new sense of gratitude, haven't we, for those on the front line of retail who are risking their lives to make sure that we're fed and have access to medicine. But even those retailers have had to look very carefully at their e-commerce capabilities, their supply chains, and how they shore up their businesses to cope with the demand, which when we first went into lockdown was equivalent to having Christmas every day for 3 weeks. And so it seems to us really clear that those businesses that have embraced e-commerce and the reality of e-commerce and are looking to partner with other businesses in order to diversify the retail offerings such that it is much more experiential are going to be the ones that weather the storm above those that stick to the old ways of doing things. The other trend that we've seen is, most of us, when we're trying to get an Ocado shop done, we're having to wait 2 or 3 weeks for a slot. And so what that's done is it's meant that we've all started shopping more locally. We're all going to our local butchers, our local greengrocers, local bakers, the corner shops. And so it's really interesting. The one thing that's become clear for the future of the high street is where you've got good quality housing, thriving local businesses, that's where you can bring in the amenities of retail, leisure to support those, because you have increased footfall, increased income to spend. So it is very much about embracing e-commerce, partnering if you need to with people who are experts at it, who can support you, partnering with others to create vibrant places where we can eat, drink, shop, which are close to where we live and work.
And how much of a role do you think leisure will play in this new look high street that's emerging?
We imagine that leisure will be a really important component, but it'll be a new type of leisure, given the requirement to socially distance seems to be around for quite some time. But what we're thinking and what people are talking about is having leisure concepts such as crazy golf. Having, bars and cafes that double up as bookshops, having flexible spaces which you can use for one use during the day, another use during the early evening, and another use again later in the evening. But the leisure component will be quite key because we are social creatures. And the one thing that I think lockdown has brought home to all of us, those of us that don't enjoy an abundance of green space, open space or community, is that we're not designed to live like islands. We do crave that social contact. And so having the right kind of leisure component, the right sorts of restaurants, cafes, bars and activities will be quite key to making these spaces vibrant.
Well, that's the key word there, isn't it? Being vibrant, because at the moment they're the very opposite of that, aren't they? And what's been interesting, I think, for a lot of people to observe is this phenomenal rise, yes, in online, but the limited capacity to deal with that rise in demand on the part of logistics networks. What's your take on what needs to improve in that area in terms of the warehousing, and where does it need to be? Is it going to sort of remain in these industrial hubs, or does it need to become even more urban? What's that going to look like?
You're absolutely right about the importance of the warehousing and logistics piece in this. And you can't open a paper these days without reading a headline about Amazon having acquired yet more retail space to repurpose as distribution hubs. Equally, we've seen Boohoo, the online retailer, having announced that it's very keen to buy up high street chains in the UK and Europe, not because it wants a high street presence, but because it needs more storage space. Similar stories with Next and Primark, all investing in warehousing space. And so it's really clear that we are going to continue to buy our goods online, but we may well want to be able to go somewhere locally to pick them up from. And so, interestingly, we have launched an initiative at Dentons globally where we're actually connecting those of our clients with significant exposure to retail with our clients who are in freight, distribution and logistics, because we can see that this collaboration is necessarily going to be required between these two sectors to address the reimagining of retail, which is going to be inevitably required, as well as the uptick in business requirements for logistics and warehousing.
And I think we're going to see, and we're already seeing, aren't we, the emergence of Deliveroo style services for small local retailers. I think that could be quite an interesting new trend to keep an eye on, because obviously you've seen where Deliveroo has gone and Uber Eats. Do you think that could be something that we see a lot more of across our towns and cities? I think currently it's only there's a new operator that's launched in, I want to say, Cambridge and Brighton, possibly, or Bristol, but they're thinking about coming to London. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we are definitely going to see much more partnering between sort of delivery and traditional methods of supplying. And we're already seeing that in the restaurant industry, aren't we? A lot of the restaurants who were forced to shut down have kept their takeaway services open. And so inevitably, I think we are going to see much more of that kind of partnering and collaborating. And the logistics warehousing piece is going to be really important to that, because these guys are all going to need space to store things, move things from not too great distances to be sure that they can get from A to B to be able to meet that supply.
Sorry, you've also got the big retailers who are taking quite chunky units, so big warehouses to store mothballed stock that they're going to sell next year. So expect summer 2021 to look very similar fashion-wise to summer 2020.
Indeed. In fact, some of us actually, Liz, are waiting to get our hands on those bargain items that we're of the view will continue to come back every year. So we might even get those. But there is a really important role for government and local government to play here. Because, you know, as you say, traditionally, we haven't had logistics and warehousing form part of the planning process early. So even if you look at the way when we prepared London for the Olympics, logistics and warehousing requirements were very much an afterthought and had to be plugged in later. And some of the main logistics players that we work with have said, you know, back in the day when you bought a house, nobody asked, is it fitted for broadband? Now it's a prerequisite. And a lot of the logistics players are saying that actually logistics and warehousing need to be brought to the forefront of planners' thoughts when they're looking at reimagining city centres and high streets and localities.
You're right, it needs to be considered right at the start of the process, doesn't it? You just touched upon something else that I think is a critical issue here, and it's the role of technology in reimagining the high street. Tell me your thoughts on that and what role you think tech will play.
Technology will play a really key role in differentiating those retailers that are successful and survive and weather the storm from those that don't. We've already identified that flexibility and diversity is going to be the key to reimagining our high streets and our city centres. And you're not going to achieve that flexibility unless you embrace technology. So, for example, the concept stores and pop-ups that are coming up now, you know, the being able to mix users in one space, you're only going to be able to do that if you bring the tech in. The other reason why technology is important is it's a fantastic source of data. Retailers should be looking to partner with technology companies that can give retailers that much needed data around what consumer demand is for products and pricing in particular localities, so that retailers can respond to that. That way they can make sure they can actually make some money.
Oh, so you think we're going to see more dynamic pricing coming in then?
Well, it's really interesting if we think about what the pandemic has done to supply chains. So the pandemic has completely disrupted the international supply chains. And so those retailers that are heavily dependent on a single supplier in, say, central China, they've really struggled to get hold of their stock, and the impact has had a knock-on effect. And a lot of the retailers we're talking to are already looking to move their supply chains closer to home, Europe, and even the UK. Now, none of that is going to be easy, of course, in practice. But what's happened because of the way this international supply chain has been impacted is retailers have been forced to look at local suppliers and local products. And guess what they've discovered? They've discovered that actually what we can make here on our doorstep at the price that we can make it at is not only as good as what we procure from abroad, but in some instances it's better. And maybe the great British public will pay the same, or if not a little bit more, for a product made in Great Britain. And so,
well, they used to, didn't they? Because that's how sort of M&S thrived for so many years, and then they stopped making things in Great Britain, and it was less of a selling point for their wares. What about, again, you touched on the regulatory and planning changes and the need for a more holistic stance right from the beginning, where all of these elements are sort of considered at the same time, so including the industrial requirements. What are the key regulatory and planning changes that you think are needed to facilitate, rather than somewhat hamper, the success of the high street?
well, I think it's less about government sort of level regulatory change, and it's more about flexibility and the removal of red tape. What we need is to be able to mix uses and move between use classes much more easily than we can at the moment. We need to have multi-use buildings, and the planning system needs to support that. And I think what we need to see is much more leadership on the part of local authorities, so that they actually use the powers they already have. For example, their powers to use CPOs to actually take hold of non-performing real estate in their localities and repurpose it, to actually look very carefully at the existing planning regime and the way in which it restricts local businesses, remove those restrictions, actually invest in creating something that works. Interesting, there's been a lot of pressure on the government to set up centralised government financed funds to actually create vibrant businesses in some of the local communities where we've seen the high streets die, because there is a definite correlation between where you've got thriving local businesses having retail and leisure pop up to support it, because inevitably you've got more income, more footfall if you've got office workers somewhere. So there's a lot of pressure that maybe the government should invest in those localities, create thriving businesses, which will in turn lead to thriving retail, and also for the government to actually buy up underperforming real estate and give it to local authorities with a mandate to repurpose it. And again, I just go back to the fact that we now know, as a result of lockdown, that we're all looking for those vibrant places that combine where we can work and live and socialise and shop and eat and drink. And the local authorities have a real role to play there, taking a much more long-term collaborative approach and easing some of the red tape and restrictions over the use classes.
It is so much more easily said than done, though, isn't it? I mean, they are very constrained resource-wise. You've got a lot of landlords in most towns. It's not all under one sort of ownership. So just trying to piece together the puzzle is a fiendishly difficult task, I think, for a lot of local authorities. But mixed use is what you're saying the future of the high street looks like, with a bit of leisure in there, possibly even a bit of industrial. How much retail do you think? What's the right sized high street going to look like in terms of the retail offering? Is it, half of what it is now?
Well, I think it'll be a different kind of retail. So, I think we're looking at much more multi-use buildings. So, for example, you could have a basement level last mile logistics. And then you can have sort of concept stores and showrooms and marketing suites for products, but actually the shopping and delivery is still all done online. And I think you're going to see more independent retailers that have personalized goods, locally produced goods, the idea of the sort of concept stores, which add a level of individuality to a locality, all of which is shrouded within sort of pop-up social spaces, green space, as well as leisure, and the key sort of providers of other things that we need. For example, all the very bad hair day photos that we all see on Instagram now due to the lockdown. It's really clear to me we're all going back to the hairdressers as soon as they're open.
Yeah. So basically what we're going to see is the emergence of quite a different looking high street, and sooner rather than later. This is not something that's 3 or 4 years down the line. This is within months, isn't it? The successful retailers will remain and should have a fairly robust model going forward. We're going to see other types of operator move into the redundant space, and there's going to be a lot of that space, isn't there? I love the idea of there being more sort of communal green space in there as well, because it's so sorely missing from a lot of shopping centres. And I think that I can envisage there being a real sort of momentum behind bringing more of that into the mix. But can you just paint a picture of what you think the high street is going to look like in, say, 2 years' time?
So some commentators, Liz, would have us believe that in 2 years' time, Oxford Street will just be one large hub for Amazon. I like to think not. I imagine that actually in 2 years' time, with this long-term, more collaborative approach between retailers, logistics and distribution, as well as local authorities, that what we'll have is spaces which are really focused on vibrancy and activity, more choices of places to eat and drink, more concept retailers, more independent retailers, these pop-up spaces, the use of sort of beacon technology, the kind of technology that picks up, right, Liz goes into the Space NK a lot, and then she goes in here, right, I'm going to send her a voucher that gives her 50% off the new concept Space NK here. That sort of technology, as well as these multi-purpose buildings where, people will be living, working, socializing, eating, drinking, exercising, all within the vicinity. And that's what the future sort of town centres and high streets ought to look like if we get this right.
That's what they ought to look like. What will they look like? Let's start with the worst case scenario. What if it all goes even more wrong than it has done? What are we sort of facing in a couple of years' time, the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario, Liz, is that actually nothing happens. We don't take advantage of this accelerated opportunity to get things right, so that, retailers either react too late or not at all to the changes in consumer behaviour and consumer spending, such that we end up with mothballed high streets, mothballed out-of-town shopping centres, swathes of real estate that's underutilised. That really is the worst case scenario. And, all of that will have a very depressing impact on communities, and we will become more isolated and siloed than we already are. The best case scenario actually is that these siloed industries and these competing landlords and competing tenants actually recognise that there is an opportunity here, and unless they take it, the alternative is dying, not surviving. And so really coming together to create these vibrant spaces and embracing technology, such that we can have stores where there is no checkout, where we have interactive kiosks and smart shopping carts, and really adapt to the 21st century way of living, working, shopping, and enjoying ourselves. So, I'm really hopeful that COVID-19 will accelerate us into the new retail, which will look and feel very different.
And there is a huge groundswell of support, isn't there, for a revival of the retail sector among the public. They just may have to change some of their priorities and think it isn't just about buying something that's really cheap and disposable. I'm going to make a sort of a decent purchase here, and I'm going to support retailers, local retailers, and big national household name retailers as well. I sense that there's that support there, and you really hope, don't you, that your best case scenario becomes the actual reality in a couple of years' time. Listen, thanks ever so much, Deepa, for a really fascinating discussion and sharing your insights into your vision of the future high street. Let's hope that that's the vision that becomes reality and not your worst case scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much.